Hello, everyone. Hello. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Sorry. Thank you for joining us tonight for Buddhist Perspectives on Grief and Renewal, a conversation with Chenxing Han and Jun Wang. I'm Izzy Angus. I'm the events coordinator for the Public Programs Department of California Institute of Integral Studies. And if you don't know, a nonprofit university in San Francisco. As many of us are descendants of settlers, immigrants, or those forcibly brought to this continent, we at CIIS Public Programs must recognize and never forget that our university's building in San Francisco occupies traditional unceded Ramaytush Ohlone lands. If you're interested in learning more about Native lands, languages, and territories where you live, we encourage you to visit native-land.ca. Tonight's conversation is being live streamed to our online audience, and also recorded for our podcast to allow us to provide accessible content to a wider audience. So if you'd like to watch it again or share it with your community, it will be available starting this evening on the CIIS Public Programs YouTube channel. And we will also feature this conversation on our podcast in the future as well. You can find it at CIISpod.com or by searching for CIIS Public Programs on your favorite podcast app. So we will have a Q&A after the conversation tonight. And for those of you watching live online, you can post your questions at any time using the web form that's linked just below this video. And for those of you here in the room, we have QR codes posted around the room that will link to that same form. And you can use your own device to post a question for our presenters. But if you don't want to be on your phones during the event or you don't want to use your own device, we do have note cards and pencils for you to write down questions. And one of us back at that table can grab that note card from you and give it to the presenters. And we'll try to get through as many questions as we have time for. For our online audience, chat will be enabled during this event, but please note that it is not being moderated and chat is not required to fully experience this event. So if you choose to participate in chat, please be respectful and avoid language that could be offensive or insensitive to others. And you can turn the chat off at any time, and we encourage you to do so if you find that it is negatively impacting your experience. If you have any issues, you can email publicprograms@ciis.edu if you have any questions during the event. Now, let me first introduce our presenters, and then we'll get right to the conversation. Jun Wang is an associate professor and core faculty of Asian Contemplative and Transcultural Studies in the Department of East-West Psychology at CIIS. Her teaching and research focus on Chinese philosophy and psychology, Taoist life cultivation, Chinese body-mind healing systems, Chan Buddhism, and meditation in Buddhist and Taoist traditions. Chenxing Han is the author of Be the Refuge, Raising the Voices of Asian American Buddhists, and One Long Listening, a memoir of grief, friendship, and spiritual care. She holds a BA from Stanford University, an MA in Buddhist Studies from the Graduate Theological Union, and a certificate in Buddhist chaplaincy from the Institute of Buddhist Studies in Berkeley, California. She's a co-teacher of Listening to the Buddhists in Our Backyard at Phillips Academy, Andover, and a co-organizer of May We Gather, a national Buddhist memorial for Asian American ancestors. And now, let me turn it over to Jun and Chenxing. Okay, wait.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us in this evening. And thank you, Chenxing. It's such a great pleasure and honor to be in a conversation with you. I just finished this book, One Long Listening, and I think we can just dive in the conversation. We have several questions. I think this is a personal memoir and also an experience of your personal experience as a hospital chaplain in the Bay Area, and also training in Buddhist chaplain in Cambodia and Taiwan. So I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about yourself and how you became interested in Buddhism and chaplain.
Sure. Thank you so much, June. It's just such a delight to be in conversation with you this evening. I also just want to thank everyone who's here in the room today. Thank you for making it out on this sunny day in San Francisco. And I want to thank everyone at CIIS who's making this event possible, our audience who's joining online, future podcast listeners, thank you for making this event possible. So, gosh, there's so many threads, right? Where to begin? Maybe for some context, it's helpful to say I was born in Shanghai, China. I came to the US when I was 4 years old. I lived in the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area, and then later in the Seattle, Washington area. And then I've been out here in the Bay Area since college, with some forays in Cambodia and Thailand. It's been a lot of moving. And I wasn't raised Buddhist, which I think is fairly common for children of immigrants, Chinese immigrants who lived through the Cultural Revolution. But as I talk about kind of in this book and also in my first book, Be the Refuge, I took a gap year between high school and college. And during that time, I had a chance to live in China and also to spend time in Thailand and Nepal and Tibet. And so seeing Buddhist people, cultures, languages, the art, the architecture of these countries just was very inspiring. And coming here in the Bay Area for college, it's actually such an extraordinarily diverse Buddhist area that we live in. So many different streams of Buddhism are here. And it took many years for me to start to connect with more of them. You know, I've hardly encountered all of them, but I can say that over time, I think we kind of connect the dots in retrospect when we look back on our lives. Just one curiosity led to another. So that kind of heart-opening experience in East Asia, Southeast Asia led to me wanting to learn more. And then also, I think my own grief and moments of suffering, I think, was also another doorway into Buddhism. And so I just started reading books. And actually, I was in South Africa studying abroad at that time, junior year, and I had this big stack of Buddhism books. And then I wanted to visit living communities. So then I was in South Africa visiting different Buddhist communities, thinking, wow, there's even all of these Buddhist communities in this unexpected place. What about in my home? You know, what about in my backyard when I go home? And so whether that was at first as a college student going to convert Buddhist communities in the Insight or Zen traditions, or going to local Chinese and Vietnamese, Cambodian, and other temples, kind of over time, just meeting Buddhists. And I like to say, like, Buddhists are part of this vast family tree that share these common roots. And I continue to sort of meet more members of the family, explore more branches of this tree. And I always learn so much from every step of this journey. And then I think you also asked about chaplaincy, right?
Just one question. Were your major in college Buddhist studies?
It wasn't actually. It was a very interdisciplinary major. It was kind of all over the place. It was called Science, Technology, and Society. And I minored in cultural and social anthropology. Sometimes I think I just chose the majors with the longest names. But in my very last quarter at college, I took a class on Buddhism and death. And that was also just really eye-opening to make me want to learn more. And so eventually I got a master's in Buddhist studies. So there were a few years between undergrad and grad school.
I see.
Yeah. And so those years were when I started to explore more in chaplaincy. So my partner, Trent Walker, who's a scholar of Southeast Asian Buddhism, had spent a lot of time in Cambodia, and he'd met Reverend Beth Goldring, an American Zen priest who started a Buddhist chaplaincy program there in Cambodia, serving people in hospitals and prisons, predominantly people with HIV. And many of the staff themselves were also HIV positive. And I realized, I didn't know very much about Buddhist chaplaincy or spiritual care. And so I had an opportunity to spend a summer with them, really just shadowing and apprenticing with them. I don't speak Khmer. My Khmer is really not very good. And so it was very humbling to be by the bedside of people who are very sick or dying, which honestly is kind of a truth of life, that at points in our lives we're all sick, we'll all die at some point. And it was just so humbling to realize nothing I'd learned up to that point had prepared me to be with people in that truth of when we encounter the ends of our lives. And I was both terrified and also just wanting to learn more. It was also a very, both sometimes very heartbreaking, but also very heart-opening experience. And I think that was really the beginning of this journey into Buddhist chaplaincy.
Well, in this book, you have so many great stories from your chaplaincy experience. But I just want to ask, I'm deeply moved by the friendship you have with your dear friend, and you talk about listening is after your friend's death, and you feel like you're continuing have a conversation with her. And can you tell us how the friendship is defined by listening?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. So this book is dedicated to Amy Frohnmeyer Wynn, and I also want to name that I am so grateful that my friend Dawn Kwan is here with her sister Nikki. Dawn is really, I think, the person who introduced you to Amy at the very beginning of our college years, since you all lived in the same dorm. And Amy was just this really extraordinary person. She had a rare genetic illness called Fanconi anemia that two of her sisters had died of. People with the illness seldom live past young adulthood. And it's something that she knew she had from a very young age. So she knew kind of this truth that applies to all of us, I would say, but she lived it deeply in her life, which is that we never know how long we have, actually. And meeting her, I read about meeting her in this book, and just sometimes you meet people and they just kind of, I don't know, I call them heart friends, or they kind of just light up your life or open this world of possibility. She felt so much like a bodhisattva to me, which I wouldn't have used that language when I met her because I wouldn't have had that language at first. But a bodhisattva as someone who listens to the cries of suffering in the world and vows to alleviate them, someone who delays their own enlightenment for the sake of others, although Amy always felt kind of enlightened in her joyful way, of the way that she lived so fully. And she was an extraordinary listener. She just had that ability to make everyone she met feel so heard and so seen. And I think to really see the best in everyone. And that's something that I really deeply needed with my own anxieties and fears and self-doubts and always feeling like I wasn't enough. But being with her, she created this place of incredible refuge. And then when I took that encounter, that teaching, and started to wonder, what does it look like to create that in the hospital or on the streets or in the prisons or in these spaces that, I've been able to go to or move through. I think really good friends, that aspect of listening has always felt so foundational to me. And I think it's a lifelong apprenticeship, that practice of listening. There's always this way of it being able to deepen in my experience. And so when she died in 2016, after, I think we only maybe had a few months to process the diagnosis, and she had a bone marrow transplant, but it wasn't successful. And she died at the age of 29. And of course, I was so bereft. At the time, I was living in Cambodia, though we had been able to fly back to Oregon to be with her at her bedside when she passed. And part of this book came from just wondering, how do I continue being in conversation with this dear, dear friend? How do I continue listening? And there were times I felt like she's still listening to me. And I think our dearest friends sometimes invite us to, as Nicole Furlong, a scholar and teacher and thinker I really admire, says, kind of listen to the lower registers. kind of putting our ear to the ground and listening to that deep humming within ourselves and within our communities, within our loved ones. I think she was my first teacher of that. And this book, I hope, is a way to continue that legacy, give that gift. You know, she just said, I just want to, she's such a compassionate person, and that's what she wanted to do, just to offer that compassion to the world.
That's so beautifully. And I just can't help but read this quote from your book when you write this. If you allow me to read this, at first you said she would ask me, "How is grieving? How is the grieving?" I would tell her, "Sometimes I feel so angry at listening bereaved word that it hurts me to talk to anyone who isn't you." And then you realize that you wrote later, you said, I realized today that our friendship has been one long listening. I'm still listening. It feels like you are too. I love you. I miss you. It's very moving. I think listening is not only a gift of friendship, but it's also the foundation for all relationships, and including the relationship with ourselves. And so I feel this book is also a way you are listening to yourself. And I think we need to ask a question: have I listened to my true self? I feel like you talk about when you are a child moved from Shanghai to America at only 4 years old, and then you cannot express the sadness or grieve to the loss. Actually, like you, one day you realize you lost your language, and you have been almost like hide your sadness and grief. And can you? And then you say writing this book is give yourself back to yourself.
Yeah.
I love that. I really admire your courage. And can you say more about this experience? Yeah.
Sure. So this book kind of maybe officially began in, was it 2016, that fall, when, no, sorry, my dates are mixed up. I think it was 2014 in the fall when I began a year-long residency in hospital chaplaincy in Oakland. So for those who've done clinical pastoral education or CPE, you know, it's kind of based on this model of action and reflection. It's not just that you're on the units offering spiritual care to people, but a very important part of the education and training is reflecting with your supervisors, with your peers, also with your fears, actually, reflecting in also reflecting theologically or spiritually or Buddhologically, you know, in my case. And I found that to be difficult. It was easier to get lost in other people's stories, in their suffering, in their grief, than to process my own. I was very burnt out after the end of that year in chaplaincy on an oncology ward. I was also often paged to Mandarin speaking patients on different units, ICU and elsewhere in the hospital. And actually that year helped me realize that there was a lot of unprocessed pain and grief, trauma in my own life. And writing has always been a way for me to deepen my intimacy into questions that feel urgent or important. And I think a question that came up at that time was, you know, why was it that certain patients afterwards I would just cry and cry because they reminded me of my uncle who died of lung cancer when I was 18, and my family didn't want me to be by his bedside because they wanted to protect me from that? Or why was it that, you know, someone who reminded me of my grandmother who passed away living with us in California? There were these moments that I realized in becoming, I guess, what's the word? So deeply, intimately connected to strangers who felt like kin, it made me see some of the gulfs that I had with my own family, with my own parents, and want to understand that more, want to have some more compassion and care around that. Yeah, so in a way, this book has felt a bit like a chaplain to me. And it was offering the spiritual care that I needed. Our supervisors always said chaplains need chaplains too. And so for me, part of chaplaining was this long act. As you know, it took 9 years from the beginning of my CPE till publication, but this long journey of reflecting on some of these stories again and again, reflecting on the grief, the loss, but then also the gifts that came from immigrating, from that break, for that I was out of my control, actually, from the losing of family, language, culture, but the gaining of another one.
I feel like many people maybe not so familiar with chaplaincy, and traditionally it's give people feeling that chaplains is a person who take care of people who are dying. But it's from your book, I feel like it's much wider. Actually, you really have a spiritual care for people, not only people who are dying but suffering. For me, that's a job for bodhisattvas, not for how kind of common person can be trained to do this kind of work. What do you think? What do you think about this?
I think everybody is a bodhisattva, so I think it's a work that all of us can do. But truly, I think that we're all offering spiritual care in small ways, in big ways. And sometimes we don't even know the impact we have on other people, whether just a smile you gave someone, and they'll never be able to tell you that that smile really helped them through a really tough time in their life. Or, I remember after Amy died, being in Cambodia, and I would just go to this yoga class on the waterfront with Dwi. And I don't think anyone in that class knew like how much I needed those classes, how much they were my bodhisattvas, even if we didn't always share the same language. But I think there's this passage in this book, right, where one of my interviewees for my first project really helped me understand. She said, every time we ask for help and that request for help is answered, it's kind of like your prayer has been answered. And it's kind of like a bodhisattva has just responded to your prayer. Sometimes I think the harder thing is to ask for help, is to allow ourselves to receive. I think especially for people who tend to give a lot or do a lot, the harder thing can be actually to receive that help, to allow someone else to be a bodhisattva for you. But I'm really interested in expanding what we mean by chaplaincy or spiritual care. I think the profession itself is thinking a lot about this. What does it look like to diversify the ranks of chaplaincy in this country, which remains still predominantly white and Christian? But of course, the people who receive spiritual care is, vast and diverse and colorful and myriad as this country itself. And so in whatever small way, if this book can help show kind of more sides of what spiritual care and chaplaincy can be. And I think that's so fitting for a place like the CIIS, which is so full of creative possibility in a way. We're looking at that place where creativity and spiritual care meet. And I think actually those are inextricably woven. And for me, writing as spiritual practice, as spiritual care, as chaplaincy, those all form this kind of braid or this kind of river. And it's a wonderful river to be in, float in, paddleboard on, sit in, sometimes swim against the stream in, whatever the metaphor is. But I think there are as many ways to do chaplaincy as there are chaplains in the world.
Great. Yeah. Thank you. I really appreciate the phrase, one of the Buddhist teaching you brought in the practice of chaplaincies, 不知最亲切. It's a less known Buddhist teaching. So I'm curious, like where does this, actually this means now knowing is most intimate. So you have the Chinese phrase there and then the English. So do you want to talk about where's the contact of this phrase and what does it mean to you?
Sure. So It came to me first through the English because I heard it a lot in different Zen communities. Not knowing is most intimate. So in a way, this feels like a very American Buddhist moment, right? Many people have read the book Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind by Suzuki Roshi, who's had such a powerful impact here in San Francisco and with the San Francisco Zen Center as its founding teacher. And I think those two phrases are very interconnected. And then I got curious, oh, what is the Chinese? 不知最亲切. It's kind of a, if you don't read a lot of Buddhist texts, it's kind of a unusual phrase, right? It's not something you would say just in everyday speech. But entering into it in both the English and the Chinese being my first language, made it feel, it's just such an intriguing idea. I think especially for someone who tends to be a perfectionist and who tends to want to control things and have things turn out the way, my mind wants them to turn out, there's a kind of letting go and a kind of permission, but then a kind of like openness to an infinitude of possibilities. Like Suzuki Roshi always said, in the beginner's mind, I'm paraphrasing, in the beginner's mind, there are infinite possibilities. And
it's interesting. I have to admit, actually, as a Chinese, also Buddhist students, myself, I never heard about this phrase before I read your book. Actually, it's not very common even in Chinese. So my feeling is 不知最亲切. When I first saw this phrase, I think about Taoist teaching, actually, like Lao Tzu will say, now knowing, also Zhuangzi. I think maybe the Chan Buddhism derived this idea of now knowing from Taoism, from Lao Tzu's Dao De Jing. There's a chapter talk about if you can rule the country by no knowledge. And also Zhuangzi talk a lot about the attitude or the doing without action, so that's similar with the 不知, but the 不知 is very familiar for many people, but why 最亲切, why is intimate? So that's the part I hope you can elaborate a little bit.
And maybe I have to offer, and I don't know, but I would like to learn more, to ask textual scholars, which I am not a textual scholar of Buddhism, but I think that's really interesting. And you're linking it to Wu Wei, I think, in Taoism. And I mean, to me, it's like that stream, or that kind of reverse stream of Japanese Zen Buddhism based on Chinese Chan Buddhism. And it's very interesting, I think, what different cultural contexts pick up. And I totally agree with you, 不亲切. It's not a phrase I encounter in other Buddhist texts. And so I couldn't answer as a textual scholar, what does that part mean? I could answer as a contemporary Buddhist, I guess, just that it's fascinating to me, like what kind of, because I'm sure what intimacy meant in the context many centuries ago is different than how we think about it now, I think. But so much too of chaplaincy and spiritual care, I think, is this looking back into history, into sacred texts that are passed on to us from translations that have gone through many cultures sometimes, as is the case in Buddhism, and then interpreting it for ourselves, right? And so I don't know if there's a right way to interpret it. I'm sure scholars could debate and find different contexts or look for it in different texts. But I guess when I was thinking about it, it had to do, in the case of writing this book, with that kind of enormity of grief and like all the things it throws us into, all the uncertainty, and also just like chaplaincy visits. Before walking into a room, I would have no idea what to expect on the other end. And that was both completely terrifying and also kind of completely liberating. There was something about really meeting the moment, really meeting the circumstances, and having to kind of, I guess, rest in this, rest in this sense of I am enough, they are enough, we're enough, and hopefully something in this encounter will be transformative or healing or reduce the suffering or increase the joy or whatever it is, I think hopefully something will happen in that moment. And sometimes it doesn't work out. Many moments in this book are when those visits went poorly. But even then, I think there's a teaching there.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's so many layers of now knowing and 最亲切 intimacy. In addition to like what you said in your book about now knowing, before you enter the door, like as a chaplaincy, you don't really know what will happen, and the humility But I also feel, I also read actually from your book about this now knowing from the counterpoint, most time like our parents, for example, or teachers or people who are in a higher position, they think they know. Scientists, they think they know. The doctors in the hospital, they think they know. They even told the patient how long you can live, right? But this kind of knowing sometimes can be a violence. And I think Buddhism and Taoism share a similar view of the knowledge or knowing. Like when we think we know, that's already ignorant. Do you agree with that? Because I read like several times you reverse the phrase, the question, like, oh, when your when your uncle's dying, like your relatives trying to protect you, not allow you to go to the bedside of your uncle. And I think a lot of Chinese parents too, they think they know what's the best for their children, so they try to do things right. And I feel like a lot of your memories about your childhood, you feel angry about that. Is exactly, I think, is a kind of response to the kind of knowing, the violence of knowing. Of course, you didn't say that explicitly, but I read it like that. And there's some other parts when you talk about some mainstream misunderstandings of Buddhism, and they think they know what Buddhism should be like, right? So they feel like superior, like you should do this, you should do meditation for how many hours, that's the right Buddhism, that's what you should do. I think in the spirituality, a lot of people are trying to behave like as if they know, but they didn't know. Actually, the more you know, the more you don't know. Forget about the knowing come from not knowing.
Yeah.
So I found that's a very profound phrase actually in your book. Although I'm trying to also think about what 亲切 can best translate into English. Yeah, intimacy or 亲, because 亲 and 心 is very similar in Chinese. The great learning, the Confucian is the great learning, teach us, every day you want to be 亲, 亲 mean to love the people. So 亲 is both have this, I think the meaning of renewal as well as intimate, right? Yeah, because 亲 and 心 have the same root, radical. So I just feel this phrase just 5 character, but very, very profound. Yeah.
It's so powerful to hear you reflect on all of this, especially that piece around renewal, because I think when you speak of kind of the violence of knowing, I think we've all been there when we were so certain about something or we were right and really attached that outcome. All the other possibilities we foreclosed, all of the other pathways we shut down. There was a kind of like not allowing of renewal. And I think something about in Buddhist thought that I come back to again and again is this acceptance of impermanence, of change. And, I think sometimes in the popular culture, it can seem very depressing or morbid, or it's so focused on death. But I think over time, over the years, the more I reflect on that, the more I find it to be a very hopeful teaching, especially when I think also about teachings on karma, which at its root are just teachings about action, that every action of body, speech, and mind has some kind of effect, and intention is an important part of this as well. And so for me, that kind of not knowing the outcome was both felt like the truth and felt like a gift when people don't know what's ahead and they're honest about it. Where is my mom now that she's dead? How can I answer, except to say, I really don't know, but I can sit with you here in asking that question, and let's talk about where you feel she is. Let's talk about where you'd like her to be. Let's talk about some of these different possibilities. And that same conversation could happen again, a day later, a week later, and maybe it would be a different conversation. I think something about that generative way of holding, not knowing, feels like it's, just at the root of so much that is good and so much that is loving.
Yeah, I feel, as you said, the beginner's mind or not knowing is also open so many possibilities, right? When you remain not knowing, like, so that's what I feel like so important for healthcare in the people, when in the treatment and healing. And I think also in education, teachers should adopt this concept of not knowing 最亲切. So I one of my favorite part is actually the way you use 成语, the 4 character Chinese characters, idioms, usually translated as, and you use 7 成语 as the title of your chapters. So I feel that they are very interesting and very have deep implications. Do you mind to talk maybe 1 or 2 of them, like why you choose this 成语, and what's how do you see the connection between the 成语 and the stories in your chapter? Especially, I think the one I like most is 杯弓蛇影, shadows and snake. So do you want to talk about the story and more about your...
Sure. And I should say, this book came about in such an interesting way, really fragments and pieces. And then it started to coalesce, and then it sort of divided itself into these parts. And then kind of belatedly, I realized there were certain themes or images that kept appearing. And for the 杯弓蛇影 chapter, I read about it in the book, but maybe I'll just summarize it here. It comes from this story about a man who goes to a party at his friend's, and has a little goblet of wine, and he's about to drink it, and then he sees there's a snake swimming in his goblet of wine. So he's very freaked out, but he also doesn't want to be a party pooper, so he just drinks the wine. But then he gets very sick, and his friend is like, dude, what happened to that guy? The actual story is probably not told this colloquially, but he's like, I'm kind of worried about him. And so he goes to find his friend who's deathly ill in bed. And the friend finally confesses, yeah, well, I was at your place and I drank the wine with the snake in it. And then his friend, the host, realizes there was a gong, which if you see the Chinese character, it looks like a kind of very squiggly, almost like a snake.
Even the real gong actually
exactly.
is like a snake. The shadow of the handle part of the bow.
The bow.
Of the archery.
Yeah, for archery. And so that shadow had been cast into his cup. And in this chapter, which is part 2 of the book, I'd been exploring a lot around fear and feelings of inadequacy, going into this year-long chaplaincy program feeling like I have no idea what I'm doing, and I am not an expert. Despite Suzuki Roshi's in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few. But I just felt so sometimes paralyzed by that fear. And then also thinking too about the fears of childhood, of not fitting in, of trying to, there was so much fear, so much in my head. And it was kind of the perfect story, because it's really a story about how the fears in our head actually have very real bodily consequences. And what I love too is that his friend didn't make, the terrified man, the friend didn't make fun of him. He actually said, oh, let me show you actually what, kind of the big picture, and to help you understand. And I think yeah, and then like, and it was just funny because there were so many snakes, like literal snakes that were coming up while I was reading this section, and none of that was really planned. It was just sort of coalesced, and so it's almost as if each part of the book chose its own Chengyu in a way.
Yeah, I feel this is a wonderful Chengyu in your book, actually, because you talk about the delusion. Actually, it's not a snake, but people misunderstood it as a snake there. So they are fear and scared. Actually, this person even got very, very sick. It's like traumatized, right? It's this fear, long-term fear, you know. And then until his friend told her, "Oh, it's not a snake. It's actually the ball actually on the wall." So at the moment, you know, when you realize it's just an illusion, and it's like enlightenment, is you waken up, you know, you do not fear anymore. So I found that's both like a Buddhist teaching, right? Buddhist teaching is, you know, our suffering, so it's all because of ignorance, because we didn't see the true reality. Once you see the true reality, then your fears can go. So I think your chapter talk a lot about your fear, your own fear, you know, from childhood, and also with in the chaplaincy. And in another story, actually, you also talk about there's a kind of trauma with a spiritual teacher, and you're stalked by this one. Then, so I feel there's all connected with the fear. Absolutely. And it's long-term fear. So I wonder how do you see the fear now?
Yeah, that's a powerful question. I think, you know, fear, I guess it continues in my life. I think it's a very human thing to feel fear in different ways. But there's maybe a bit more space around it, or it's like that, I mean, something that I love about the story that we've been discussing is it's quite humorous in a way. And I'm not trying to like trivialize moments of trauma or suffering, but I think like when there's a way around fear or trauma or suffering to make a little bit of space, and maybe even make a little enough space to like have a moment of levity or a moment of humor. And I think being able to do that more, and sometimes that just happens, sometimes with the passage of time, therapy, talking to friends, there's all sorts of modalities. I think doing things that are somatic are very helpful, whatever practice that looks like. I think that's been very helpful for me. Yeah, I guess, you know, it's hard to know because I'm not feeling fearful in this exact moment.
I know it's a hard question. I know it's very, very hard.
Yeah, but I really appreciate that question. But yeah, humor is actually what kind of comes up, because that's the feedback I get from some readers, that, you know, grief is in the title of this book. In some ways it can be a heavy book or grounding book, but there's a lot of moments of humor. And I think I wasn't expecting that going into, like, thinking chaplaincy is so serious and, oh, I'm just going to go in and like pray for people. And there was just so much, I mean, people are people. So there were just so much delight and so much laughter, I think. And so there's something about like even laughter as a response to fear, or even like smile as a response to fear, or putting one's body into a state that is full of joy, like the opposite of fear. I think that, you know, I find creatures of habit, both of our minds and then even of our bodies. And I think sometimes getting stuck in trauma and fear is the body getting so used to a particular shape or a particular response or a particular reaction. And sometimes it's, what does it look like to change that? And just, sometimes that can happen abruptly, sometimes that can happen gradually. It depends. But what's helped me the most is friends, spiritual friends and teachers. I think through fear, through trauma, I could never get out of any of it alone. I think it's not created alone. And then so the way out of fear and trauma is also happens in community, in interrelationship.
Thank you. I appreciate. Yeah, I myself too. I think I'm still working on a lot of fears. in my life. So it's resonant with me when I read this story. I feel sometimes when we just looking at the fear, like sometimes in meditation, you can just look at this fear. It helps, it can help you. You just be with it, no, don't have to assume it's a fear, or just look at it to the center of the fear. And sometimes it's like a 杯弓蛇影. You realize, oh, it's actually not what I thought. It's not like what I assume that is so fearful. I know, even though it's an illusion, but the feeling is true. The fear is so true. But once you look at this fear, directly to the center, just to be with it, sometimes it's have the same effect as the friend pointing to the ball.
Yes, yes.
I don't know what time. Okay, still have 10 minutes. We another just a very short question, maybe about the another 成语, 沧海桑田. It means big change. It means the Chinese 成语 is means like ocean become a field. Like how much change, like Himalaya mountain, before it's the ocean, now it's a Himalaya mountain. So you use this 成语 quite kind of maybe indicating some change. And you also talk about one of your spiritual friend or teacher told you, like after someone beloved, someone died in our life, so it's a chance to redefine ourselves. So I feel like the 沧海桑田, is a redefining process. So have you changed, or have you feel, what do you feel since 2016?
I think I certainly have changed. I don't know if I can say to the extent that an ocean becoming a mulberry field in that kind of geologic time. But, I think I began this book in grief in some ways. And I really began when Amy died, and just was starting to write letters to her and feeling like she'll never read these letters. I'll never be able to speak to her again. So began it in grief and anger too. And then the more I wrote over the years, the more I felt like the book was just calling me into joy and laughter. At the end of her life, Amy was so funny, like wickedly funny. She was always funny, but like for her to have leukemia, like intent, really advanced leukemia that she was going to die from, and still be singing Taylor Swift's Bad Blood. I mean, things like that I don't know. I think there was a way in which she embodied that for me. And I think she always said this season after the passing of the loved one is a time for us to redefine who we want to be in their absence. And that felt like such an invitation, a gift. It was a question that I get to keep asking. And I still ask that question. I still miss her, and it's like one of the patients whom I met in the hospital told me about her daughter who had died 20 years prior, and her husband was in the hospital and he was dying. And she said, sometimes it feels like my daughter, it was like her death was just yesterday. It hits that hard. And when she said that, it felt like the biggest gift to not have to make grief this linear thing that we have to get through and get over, that some days it's just gonna feel that way. And that kind of like fear, like grief, it's okay. Like in a culture that tends to want to push away these emotions, I think, what does it look like to actually befriend them, to listen to them too, and listen deeply, and listen into what they are inviting us into?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah. Let me see. I can maybe have time to ask one more. I have more questions actually. Just to choose one from the rest on my page. I think there are many misperceptions of Buddhism, and you mentioned one about meditation. So it's very humorous, actually, the way you write about your experience about meditation. Do you want to share a little bit about that? Like,
Sure, I
how
can share
people-
briefly. I'm a
yeah.
terrible meditator. I tend to fall asleep. I've read about that in the book. But I think too, in the span of writing this book, watching mindfulness becoming this multi-billion-dollar industry, and just trying to hold that with both joy, because I think that helps so many people, but then also thinking about issues of appropriation, or thinking through what does it mean to take something out of its context, which is a very rich context full of ritual, community, there's so much there, and then to apply it as this technology in a way. I think about that a lot. I think these are open questions that we're thinking about more. And for me, so much of what I've learned is about the diversity of different spiritual practices, particularly Buddhist practices, chanting, bowing, prostration, generosity as a foundation of the Buddhist path. It's like that knowing thing. If we know the right way, it's just this one kind of seated meditation. What are we missing? Or what might we not be able to offer someone who might need something else? I mentioned Reverend Goldring. When she went to Cambodia at first, she thought she would get people to do seated meditation. And she quickly realized people were so sick that what they needed was actually something much gentler and easier. So they got chanting by their bedsides. They got Reiki, actually, which they understood to be a meditation of the hands. They were given, of course, food and medicine as well. But for her, having to let go of this idea that they would all be, sitting in perfect lotus position and following their breath, I think we have to meet people where they are. And there's so many people out there whom we're not listening to or not thinking of. And I think a lot about that. I think a lot about Guan Yin listening to the cries of the world, and to try to embody that more. What does it mean? We return again, right, to listen to these lower registers, to notice when we might fixate on one thing, and in so doing, maybe there are whole worlds that we are missing.
Yeah, for me, I think meditation, there's many meanings of meditation, also depending on where your practice are. It is a major part in Buddhist practice, but it's mainly because, but there's many other religions also use meditation, or many other practice in meditation. But I think meditation is really to be with yourself, to learn to be with yourself and observe the mind, heart, and so it doesn't mean you have to sit there, and also I think sitting a long time meditation really need energy, as you said, in this Cambodia settings, many people are sick and weak. So if you force them to do meditation, that's just harmful. That's the opposite to compassion, right? Yeah. So actually, Bodhidharma, when the Zen patriarch come to China, he went to Shaolin Temple, and he saw many monks meditate, and their body become very weak. So they teach them I Ching Jing, Qigong practice. Actually, we still practice today. And so it's accompanied with meditation. So I really like the way you talk about these misunderstandings. Another Buddhist teaching, maybe Buddhist way of understanding. Just briefly, if you don't mind, to talk about maybe about the Buddha told Ananda, friendship is the whole of the holy life, and then you also mentioned the 缘分, the karma. What do you think about like this? Karma, reincarnation, even the rainbow signs. You saw the double rainbow when you send the ashes of your friend. So can you talk a little bit about that, this mystic?
I feel like you've hit on the heart of the book, and I know we're getting to the end of our conversation, so maybe I'll read just one page as a response to your question.
Perfect.
I haven't been able to read this page. It's toward the end of the book in the I Ching and Sanzen, but maybe this will be a way to close. It took grieving other people's stories to learn how to grieve my own. I think of the mercy in the Eritrean uncle's words. It won't be finished in a day. The final blessing from my CPE supervisors was the same benediction my patients had been giving me all year. Chaplaincy needs writers too. They spoke what I needed long before I dared to myself. I am a sparrow on the Phnom Penh riverfront. The cages are gone, the birdseed too. Before and after me, infinite choices, intimate not knowing. As a dear friend once wrote, there is nothing missing in the moments it takes for me to turn over each heirloom tomato at the farmer's market, not just because I'm looking for one to buy, but also because each is unique and lumpy and bitten and unexpected. There's nothing missing in admiring the quirky college student making circles on her bike with a giant sunflower hanging out of her backpack. And there is only beauty in taking some time to wonder about the notes this precious old man in glasses across from me is writing in the margins of his book. There is no one there to witness or acknowledge those things, but they're absolutely precious, if only just to ourselves. And this is Amy, of course. There is nothing missing the day a dear friend invites me to a museum exhibit that ignites our pandemic-dulled brains. There is only joy in the hours of outdoor conversation afterward, even if we are cold and masked and about to pee our pants. We are grappling with what it means to be Asian American Buddhist, and it feels like chasing that proverbial pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And then we are laughing about the closure of no closure. And all I can think as she worries a London plane leaf between her fingers is, we are the rainbow. We are golden.
Thank you. Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is a wonderful closure for our conversation, and we can open to questions, I think. Yeah. Thank you. So questions, I think I will just read. Maybe you can see questions from the audience. First one, do you have advice for those of us who are grappling with fear of death and a fear of experiencing grief? Someone very dear to me is dying, and I'm finding that I'm afraid to confront my grief now, and I'm afraid of even greater grief I'm going to feel after he's gone.
Thank you for that question, that very tender and vulnerable question. I think, can I make sure to see it? Thank you. I think my first response is just that you're not alone to feel afraid, right? It's so hard to lose someone we love or to be in that anticipatory grief. Take really good care. I think maybe that's the piece of advice that my supervisors always gave us. They said, be unwavering in your self-care, whatever that looks like for you. And I think sometimes I wish we had a different word for self-care, because it can be reduced to yet another checklist of things we should do for ourselves. But what does it look like to listen deeply to the pain and maybe just embrace that? Embrace where you are now, embrace being afraid, embrace that whole messiness. Gil Fronsdal, one of the Buddhist teachers here in the Bay at the Insight Meditation Center at Redwood City, one of my first chaplaincy teachers, had said, chaplaincy works better if the chaplain is imperfect. And I think, too, that's true for being a friend. Works better when we allow ourselves some permission to be perfect and imperfect, and allow those imperfections to be maybe part of our practice, something we work through, can be with. I'm curious, actually, Jun, how you would answer this question, because I know you do so many different practices, qigong and prostrations. And
I agree with you, actually. I think everyone have grief, because grief is a response to a loss and even suffering. And I think the fear of grief is maybe a problem in our society. I think because we always expecting happiness, but if I think loss is not comfortable, grief is not comfortable, not happy experience, but not allow grief is horrible. I think if you don't allow grief, is a harmer than grief itself. Is worse than grief itself. I think. Yeah, I just remind me about Confucius mentioned in Confucius' time, his people practice actually 3-year grief after one's parents pass away. So that's how long it should take. It should take 3 years to grieve. And it's a very common practice in Confucius society, actually. So people should have time to grieve. Like, why people are afraid of grief? Grief is a gift, as you mentioned in your book. It's a bonus of life. Why we receive this gift? So that's what I'm in my mind right now. But
I love what you say too about the 3 years, because I think it reminds me of ritual. I think that is so much of what care looks like in Buddhist traditions. Every 7 days for 49 days, there are rituals done in community. And then there's 1 year, 3 year, 7 year, 13 year. And so I think sometimes too, what does it look like first to be with that ritual while your friend is still alive, how to be connected? And that's a hard time too. If I know with Amy, I wrote many more emails to her than she was able to respond to during that time when she was passing away. But that was also a way of, for me, grieving. And as she would say, we're here to love on each other like nobody's business. And I think that fear of grief that's there is maybe just a manifestation of that love, that it's such a normal and healthy response. And that if there's ways to find people with whom you can be in community, who can do even the simplest of rituals. I mean, to me, like even drawing a bath and being in the bath and just crying in the bath, like that's a ritual. Pouring yourself a cup of tea and just sitting, finding some way to have beauty, some way to have permission to just be exactly as you are with however you're feeling.
Exactly, like collective grief. Like
Yes.
I hope we can do like occasionally do some collective grief rituals. So it's okay. But there's quite a few questions. Next question from the audience. Can you share with us a practice for connecting with the spirits of our loved ones once they have passed?
Oh, I think there are probably so many, so many practices across many different traditions.
Yeah.
Let's see, connecting with the spirit.
I can say my experience. I usually, I think in Asian or Chinese culture, we burn incense. Also burn incense, the smoke of the incense connecting with the invisible world. And then you can talk, meditate with the incense burning. So that's one way I'm trying to connect with people passed away in my life.
It's funny, that's also the first thing I thought of, like having a kind of like altar and incense and maybe offering a favorite food or something that that person loved. Yeah.
Oh, do you want to say more about this? Connect with the spirits of our loved ones once they have passed. The spirits, yeah. What do you feel? Do you feel you are connected with Amy in spirits?
I do, absolutely. Yeah. I think maybe some of that is also around this embodiment, like what is a part of that person that you want to embody and just deliver to the world? What was their gift to the world that you can embody in some way? So I think in a way, the answer to this question might be quite individual to the person whose spirit that you're honoring. So I guess in a way, maybe the response to the question is kind of an invitation to creativity, to try different things. And maybe something doesn't work. That's okay. To try something else. Ask other people in your life, how do you connect to those?
Yeah, there's so
spirits in
many
your life?
ways,
Yeah.
right? You can connect with. Yeah, I think everyone have their own ways.
Exactly. But I think, even in the examples we gave, if there's a way to like really engage all of our senses and not just like our thinking minds, I think
Right.
that can feel sometimes very connecting and very tangible, since spirits can feel like such an intangible thing. But how do we, really bring it into all of our senses?
Right. Yeah. And in China, every May, every April, like the lunar year the calendar, the 清明节, the April 5th is the time you connect with the people who died. I think in Mexican tradition, there's a day of death, November 2nd, usually. It's also have a shrine. It's a collective, actually, again, very practice. Okay, next one question. Thank you so much for so many beautiful points. You mentioned anger with your grief upon starting the book. Can you share more about how you tended to the anger when it arose and how you see it in your current life?
Yeah, there's actually in my first book, Be the Refuge, a chapter called Anger. So the writing of those two books, each of which took 9 years, overlapped. So maybe as a response to that question, I might actually mention the chapter in Be the Refuge. Part of what began, how Be the Refuge began, was there is a blog called The Angry Asian Buddhist, which is a spin-off of The Angry Asian Man. But Angry Asian Buddhist was such a eye-catching title because we don't expect Buddhists to be angry and we don't expect Asians to be angry. There's stereotypes that we don't rock the boat. And for me, as I read this blog and then got to know the person who wrote the blog, Aaron Lee, who also actually tragically died of cancer a year after Amy at the age of 34. So he too was a spiritual friend, and Be the Refuge is very much kind of a tribute to him. But in my friendship with Aaron, I think it started to help me work through anger, and with him, and then also with my supervisors in the hospital, who would just say, anger is information, anger is energy at its base. And so I think in Buddhist traditions, I very much agree that being mired in anger, being unable to get out of it, can be very harmful. I think I definitely experienced that at times in Cambodia after Amy's death, and that would just manifest in different ways of desire to be isolated and shut off, or being just really like obsessive and compulsive about different things. All of that, I think, was part of the process for me. I think kind of like with grief, like what does it look like to not deny it, but also to not rush through it or shove it away, in a kind of violent manner? I think that's can be challenging, but to me, that's kind of the koan. That's the question. What does it look like to be with the anger? What is it telling me? What is it informing me? Is it telling me that there is some form of injustice? And I think in the case of the Angry Asian Buddhists, writing about issues of race and representation in American Buddhism, when 2/3 of Buddhists in this country are of Asian heritage, but the mainstream media representations are far from that, I think his anger actually came from a place of love for his communities, came from a place of concern for young people who were getting messages that their Asian families and their practices were superstitious, were backwards, were not real Buddhism. So I think that anger could actually be quite fruitful and positive if wielded in a way or transformed in a way that can reduce harm toward oneself and others. And so too, similarly now, I think it's not like anger is still something I grapple with and work with, sometimes more skillfully than others, but remembering that it's one of those visitors that come up from time to time, but that it's a powerful teacher, and that it has important information, and that it can actually be a very energizing emotion. And then it depends on how do we use the anger. So I think that's the kind of journey that my books help me take with anger.
Okay, so next question. Do you feel your relationship with your parents improved, got closer processed after writing this book?
It's so
Good
I'm
question.
smiling because actually several people have asked this question or a version of this question. One way I like to answer this question is I recorded the audiobook for this book, which was really fun because, you know, it's multilingual, that there's mainly English, but there's also Mandarin and Shanghainese and sprinklings of Khmer and Thai and Japanese. And my parents actually make cameos in the audiobook. And I've had many listeners say that those moments are really powerful when they hear my mom reading in Chinese the song that she sings, or when they hear my dad. And so, yes, you know, I think it's always work in progress. The book opens with my parents suggesting, when I tell them that I'm going to Taiwan to learn more about Buddhist chaplaincy, my mom says, you're throwing your life away. The Taiwanese economy is really bad. My dad suggests a total career reboot. So in retrospect, I think there's a way in which I find now some more humor and understanding in all of that. My parents are both computer engineers. They're like, what happened to this daughter? You know, and I see that, you know, their comments, well, at the time, maybe hurtful. In retrospect, I see it comes from a place of concern, of wanting to make sure that I will be okay, that I'll be protected and provided for. And so, yes, and I think part of that was actually simply just sitting with at the bedside of so many people who are sick and dying, and realizing this is someone's parent too. This could be my parents. Yes, I'm still going to get into arguments. We're still going to annoy each other. Like, those moments will happen. But if I can catch myself more often and remember, wow, I don't have forever with my parents, and try to focus on what are the qualities I do want to cultivate with them, realizing that I have agency in the relationship to also change it, and realizing they're also always changing. I think writing this book, reflecting on my own past, made me realize how much my parents have changed, you know, in their lifetimes, which are of course much longer than my lifetimes. And it helped me see them. It helped me have a sense of not knowing with them. And I think that sense of not knowing, maybe paradoxically or erratically, made me feel closer to them, made me feel more intimate with them, made me feel less like I had to insist they be or act a certain way and control them a certain way, and realize that they are complex, messy human beings, just like me, just like everybody else I encounter.
Yes. I think you just made a great point. Yeah. Even with people we know for our whole lifetime, we can practice not knowing. That's a great point. Thank you. We have so many great questions. Thank you for the audience. There's another one. What was the most delightful for you to write about this in the book, and what most challenging?
Oh, I love this question. Gosh, what was the most delightful? Honestly, actually, a lot of remembering the memories with Amy was really joyful. The letters kind of poured out. Like, you know, at one point I'm like, Amy, I'm talking to you. It's my birthday. And like, I was like talking to you in the car, which is something I would sometimes do on long car rides. And then suddenly I'm just like crying. So then I'm like laughing and crying and talking at the same time. And then I go to like look for the Kleenex. And of course, my husband has used up all the Kleenex and not replaced it. Go figure. Well, shocking, right? And I think all those moments of actually writing these letters, like these, you know, I call the book as kind of a love letter to her. So that it was actually very delightful, paradoxically. Like, I'd be bawling and realizing like it's such a joy to remember the people that we love. And so maybe the second part of the challenging parts, maybe I think writing about, maybe mostly deciding how much to write about, particularly the stalking and the abuse from the spiritual teacher, which felt like, in some ways, I have always thought if I were to write about that, it would have to be fiction. And I wanted to weave it in because it was a part of that journey. And I met so many people in the hospital, particularly women who had been, you know, who were in situations of abuse and violence. And something that I thought about in being in conversation with them that I appreciated about being a chaplain was that they could tell me as little or as much as they wanted to. And so for me, I think one of the challenging parts was actually calibrating how much of that in the context of this particular book that I wanted to share. Yeah, so I appreciate that question. Really thoughtful.
Next one. I love how present and such a strong listener throughout the book. With the rise in social media, what are your suggestions to have the younger generation stop and listen more with their hearts?
Yeah, that's such a concern on all of our minds, I think. Last Sunday I was at San Quentin, which has a Buddhist Sangha there, and I was able to spend maybe about 6 or 7 hours there. And what really struck me is you leave your phone, with the guards before you go in. And not to romanticize that setting, which is, of course, very difficult, but I was so struck by how those hours felt when none of us, no 20 of us in a room, were within, any access of a phone. The kind of depth of listening and connection and care in that room, the depth of focus was extraordinary. And so in terms of suggestions, I think collectively, let's start raising our voice, and then let's talk about structural ways that we need to change our educational settings. There's things we can do in our own homes, and I think there's a lot of advice, but I think at a more structural level, if you're the one person who's not using your phone and everyone around you is, that just feels lonely. But if everyone, and I think we can learn a lot from traditions of taking Sabbath, if everyone around you has decided, actually, I have more joyful and meaningful things to fill this time with, and collectively we're going to agree to turn off these phones, lock them up. I almost feel like that's sometimes what we need to do, to not use social media, just to listen and to notice in what ways. I'm not saying it's all bad. Sometimes social media helps us connect. Sometimes, it really is helpful, but a lot of times I think it really erodes our ability to connect with each other and to listen deeply. So how do we create more spaces of sacred space and refuge that get to be free of that for some time? How do we feel? And if actually, maybe it's uncomfortable at first, but wow, I felt like that was the biggest gift, to spend those hours in that prison. I felt so free, actually.
Great question. Yeah, great suggestions. I totally agree with iPhone, the mobile phone. If you can, even if it's just to put it there, as long as our eyes can look at it, it's distraction actually. So it's best to put it away, at least when you have a conversation with someone and or practice meditation. For me, I think it's so important to just pause and slow down to listen. Yeah. I think we are coming to the time, closing time. It's been a great pleasure, and I just want to thank you for having this opportunity to be able to talk with you about your book and the great points and the offerings. And thank you for writing this book. It's a gift to me, and I'm sure to so many people. Will read your book, and also thank you for the audience for your questions, and especially the people who are here present in here. Thank you so much. I think we are ending.